Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a project by the Stove Network designed to encourage pioneering approaches in charting the changes that have happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 locally, and tries to navigate the way forward into a more hopeful and shared future. In this series, Stove orchestrator Matt Baker speaks with the artists, writers and researchers involved in the project, offering an insight into the process and discoveries each have made. We hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the Atlas Pandemica podcast number 2. I'm Matt Baker, and along with artist Robbie Coleman, I'm one of the curators of this project. Atlas Pandemica, at Maps to a Kinder World, is a compendium of 10 projects led by creative people, each investigating a different theme highlighted by life during the COVID pandemic. Projects work directly with people in Dumfries and Galloway, focusing on the impacts and the learning from the community's experience of the evolving pandemic. Atlas Pandemica was conceived and is managed by the community-led arts organisation, the Stove Network. It explores local responses to the pandemic and how these might shape new approaches to our shared future. The project is supported by Scottish Government's Supporting Communities Fund. You can find more info about the project at www.atlaspandemica.org. So in this series, I'll be talking to each of the artists leading one of the Atlas explorations, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Jenna Macrory. Jenna is a guitarist and a beatmaker from Dumfries. She is currently in her final year of university, studying folk and traditional music at Newcastle University. As an electronic music producer, Jenna uses sampling to draw attentions to social and cultural issues such as environmental and LGBTQ+ issues. Her Atlas Pandemica project has seen her turn away from music and focus directly with matters concerning LGBTQ+ individuals in a rural setting. So let's see if we can find out a bit more about that. Welcome, Jenna. How's it going?
Matt. I'm good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
Total pleasure. Nice to see you in your Newcastle bedroom.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning.
Cool.
Can you just tell me a bit about like what attracted you to the project? You know, where were you at personally at that stage in the pandemic, and why did you want to get involved?
So I had just kind of finished my second year of study at university, and obviously we were all in it was a bit of a period of kind of turmoil, and no one knew what was happening at the time. And I think I've got to be honest, although there was a lot of uncertainty in my life around university and my education, I was quite lucky. I was very lucky, to be honest, to be in a kind of comfortable spot where I wasn't worrying about like jobs or that. However, with the whole social distancing thing, we kind of saw the entirety of the music industry like essentially put on pause. So I was kind of sitting thinking like, well, all of my shows for summer have just been cancelled. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do, really. I don't know, do I go back to university next year? And over the past couple of years, I've absolutely loved studying music, and I've just enjoyed studying and having that opportunity to learn in general. But I had really missed seeing results of things. Previously, before attending uni, I'd kind of done a little bit in events with the Stove Network, and I had missed seeing things happen. I had missed putting events on, and I really just wanted to kind of get back into that. So when I saw the Atlas Pandemica opportunity, I was like, I'm actually a year away from finishing my degree. I need to kind of start preparing for what freelance life will be. And, you know, as you yourself know, Matt, working as a freelancer nowadays does not just entail working in one genre or working on one specific thing. So I kind of saw this and I was just like, this is kind of everything I want. Like I could get the chance to kind of engage some people, like actually do something that essentially matters, because I think when you're studying, it's kind of weird to have everything revolve around you. And I kind of don't like it. It feels a little bit egotistical to me.
Well, I remember having those conversations, and I really remember sitting with you in on a beautiful, as part of that pandemic spring that was just amazing, sitting by the River Nith. And we were talking about the difference for you as a trans person at uni in Newcastle and compared with back home in Dumfries. And I remember we started talking about hate speech, and came up with this idea about it being the start of a dysfunctional conversation. I mean, and you then picked up and ran with that idea. So where did you go with that next?
Mm-hmm. So I think a really prevalent theme through my whole Atlas Pandemica project, which has been about LGBTQ identity, has been this theme of conversation. I think it's been a common theme through a lot of the projects, to be honest. But I kind of wanted to get people to stop and think why they were shouting hate speech in the first place initially. Like, why do like groups of boy racers or groups of boys in cars like think that it displays like masculinity and dominance if you're like shouting abuse at someone out of a car? It's like, I wanted to kind of engage that part of people and kind of break down like what is like why it's problematic. And I think we'll probably touch on this as we kind of progress, but like, I'm not a big believer in just having like back and forth conversations. I don't think they're very constructive. I think when you really want to like educate people and kind of give a different view, it's up to them if they take it on board, essentially. But you need to lead them to that view. You can't just say like, no, you can't shout this because it's wrong. And particularly, I mean, when I was like a teenager, like if someone told me to not do something, that would just make me do it. So I think this whole like, I think what we do on the left is really kind of important, and we've got some good conversations, but we need to kind of draw that out and get people to kind of speak about that. So in kind of exploring that and viewing this as the start of a dysfunctional conversation, I came up with these things called Tinder provocations. So the Tinder provocations were a series of thought-provoking questions, if I do say so myself, that were hosted on a Tinder account. So the reason that I chose a Tinder account to kind of reach the LGBTQ community was because we just had that immediate local reach. Like, it's very kind of geographic anyway. So yeah, we kind of used that platform as a way to kind of tease out the start of that conversation through asking some weird questions. For anyone listening at home, it literally was just a Tinder account with a load of kind of graphic questions on it. So we had like, should we take gay people to Mars? Like, has your sexuality ever influenced where you lived? What's your best coming out reaction been? Those were just a few, to name a few. So yeah, that was kind of where we took the whole like viewing hate speech as a start of a dysfunctional conversation.
I was just amazed by that you could.
Did you just see that? For anyone listening at home, the handle has literally just fallen off of my mug. Got coffee all over me.
Do you want to stop? Or is that going to be part of the vibe? So I thought that was like just a genius thing to do, to hack Tinder as a method of consulting your community. Can you? I mean, I'm really interested also in that idea about online communities, and particularly in the context of the pandemic, how important those online communities became. And can you say a bit more about that and about your experience of maybe how people behave differently in digital space?
Yeah, it was a really interesting kind of way to take the project, and it kind of provided some really interesting insights. I think like the first thing to kind of be said for that whole thing, with particular emphasis to the LGBTQ community, is that there's a lockdown seen us kind of grouped in with people that we maybe wouldn't necessarily group ourselves with, particularly for younger generations. A lot of people like myself who maybe did move back to be with parents for a longer period of time. You kind of find yourself in situations where you're maybe not sharing the same political views as people. And I say political views because to a lot of cisgender people, cisgender straight people, they do possess political views about like LGBTQ identity, but for LGBTQ people, that is their life. So, you're seeing people kind of stationed in this position where they're maybe sharing spaces where they can't actually be a full, authentic version of themselves. So then we see kind of like people move into online spaces anyway. And I think the Tinder provocations thing was interesting because we had this kind of faceless Tinder account. And I think that made people slightly more open to actually speaking to us, because particularly some of the provocation responses we did get were very personal, and like some super touching stories in there. And you just think like, I mean, you're reading these and it's literally like you've stepped into someone's life and people are just happy to share that with you all of a sudden. But then like, well, from my experiences of dating on Tinder, there's no way you would get that deep in just a like quick conversation. And I think we've seen it in life in general. I think a lot of us over lockdown have had that experience where we've maybe had longer conversations with people than we would have ever had with them before. And it's because we're social creatures and we need that. And we've been robbed of that. But because we're seeing people stuck in these spaces where they don't have this safe space to talk about or identify, they're then moving into this online realm where they are much more open.
So you can't get in there as you're saying that people can be more truly themselves in that online situation. Is that what you?
Yeah, and I think particularly during lockdown, while we're maybe out of, let's call them our natural habitats, you know what I mean? Like the spaces where we would just go about our daily business and not think about it.
That's fascinating. And so you didn't just stop with Tinder, though. You expanded into other platforms. You say a little bit about what you're doing on Instagram?
Yeah, so I think Instagram just became a bit more of an easy, accessible way of interacting. So what we did with the Instagram account is we used it to kind of just basically ask the Tinder provocations again, but reach a different kind of audience. Because the thing is, as great as Tinder was, and it was a really great insight, LGBTQ people in Dumfries and Galloway, we kind of burned through it relatively quickly. Like, I was literally just going on Tinder and constantly swiping every day. So once we kind of got through all of that, it was kind of like, well, we've got all these great questions and I want to keep asking people. So we put them on Instagram and there was just a really positive, great response from there. And then we also had some Facebook groups as well. And I think Facebook groups are a really great one because they have that, there's a bit of a community setting in them. And I think it's almost an expansion on what I've just touched upon in terms of like people being more willing to share. I think when people are stuck in these isolated settings where it's fine to talk to a faceless Tinder account, but then to have like a Facebook community of like 50 people who just understand and get it, that's where you get like some real heartfelt conversations. And it was really beautiful to see people chime in and share like some of their personal stories, and then have other people kind of chime in off the back of that, like maybe like, oh, I never knew that about you, or like, oh, I had a same experience, and just like suddenly there is that sense of community, and suddenly people don't feel as lonely.
So did you have the idea that you were that was actually a new community forming then through the work that you were doing?
I don't. So the specific groups that I targeted on Facebook, oh, that sounds really horrible, targeted, but you know what I mean. The specific groups that I reached out to on Facebook were they were already quite established, and that was kind of why I wanted to go for them, for obviously for the project's like own spread. But I think it kind of built on that, because I think a lot of the questions that are being asked in groups or LGBTQ groups are in fact, they're not even questions. In these queer groups nowadays, you're just seeing people constantly put in like, more often than not, negative news about the LGBTQ community and what is happening. And it was just nice to suddenly have people tell their stories in the middle of all this. And it was kind of like one of the last questions we asked was, what was your gayest night out? And I kind of wanted to ask more questions like that, because I wanted to just ask silly, like friendly, nice ones, because I'm a big believer in the questions we ask make the worlds that we live in. And I think that when you're constantly in a group that's constantly framing LGBTQ stuff, well, not framing it negatively, but all the news is just negative, I think we need those reminders that there are positive things, and like we are a beautiful community, and we need to hang in there, and like really, I think now more than ever, we all know that we need to hold on to the things that do make us happy and we're passionate about at the moment.
The sort of subtitle of Atlas Pandemica is Maps to a Kinder World, and I'm hearing there that I have with a lot of the Atlas projects this idea of kindness, and why do you think that the pandemic actually encouraged these ideas of kindness and sort of mutuality and support?
I think the kindness thing's a really interesting one. I kind of have my own personal opinions on that, because I think from a personal standpoint, I think kindness has been really blurred through the pandemic, because I think on a surface level, we've seen a lot of people act kinder, but I've always kind of wondered what it means to act kinder, because as much as we're trying to engage that and we're trying to reframe things in like a nicer standpoint, a bigger part of what LGBTQ Voices has been focusing on has been kind of changing opinions through conversation. And I think niceness or kindness is a really interesting one when you frame it in that context, because you can act kind without being kind. And if you apply that to kind of what we're trying to do with LGBTQ Voices, we don't necessarily just want people to we don't want people to necessarily just be nicer to us. We want people to actually not be horrible to us. And I think it's kind of bringing out the nuances of that. And going back to the kindness thing, there is a lot more kindness in the world, but as social creatures, I think it's kind of important to at least consider, is this kindness stemming from genuine kindness and a want for a better world, or is this kindness going from an isolation standpoint and the fact that people need to just speak to people more? And I think for me, kindness is dependent on if you do it for you or if you do it for other people. And I think that's more a personal opinion than a project thing. But I think, yeah.
These projects are very personal. That's what that's what being an artist is, isn't it? So, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And I mean, it takes nicely to another thing that I wanted to ask you, because one of the Tinder provocations that I was really interested in, and it's particularly relevant now in the context of legislation that's just gone through Scottish Parliament around hate speech, is what you asked, what's the difference between hate speech and free speech? In a really straightforward way. And can you say a bit more about why you were asking that, and some of the responses that you got?
Going back to that whole kind of wanting to viewing hate speech as the start of a dysfunctional conversation, that was really where that particular provocation stemmed from. And again, it stemmed from this whole thing of just like, I wanted to get people thinking about why they were saying things. And then this whole debate around like hate speech legislation has been kind of burning for a couple of years now in various countries. And I think it's interesting because prior to it being a burning issue, I don't think it was something, I'm not sure how much, it definitely wasn't a hot topic issue like it is now. However, I think that legislation has in part really kind of added fuel to the fire. I think it's important, but it was kind of getting people to again notice that and kind of really consider that. And I remember once I thought of that, I was kind of like, that's such a simple concept, actually. But we don't ever talk about that in society. Like, what is the line between hate speech and free speech? And actually, like, free speech can really be used as a vehicle to, like, well, yeah, just a vehicle for kind of like conveying just quite negative opinions. And I think you have to really question, like, when is free speech just like, I don't know. I think for me personally, it gets quite frustrating as a trans woman because as someone who's kind of at the forefront of a lot of the hate speech, I can be called whatever people want to call me, but I can't call a TERF a TERF anymore. And I think that's really interesting how free speech just pretty much upholds the patriarchal narrative that we're kind of in at the moment.
I suppose. I mean, if you look at it through the frame of kindness, if kindness was a given in our society, then that question wouldn't arise.
Mm-hmm.
It would just be about free speech. And if we were talking about if we were an accepting and an accommodating society.
Mm-hmm. And this was Atlas Pandemica for me personally has been quite an emotional journey. But that was something that kind of restored a little bit of faith in my humanity, was a lot of the responses we got to that. And I'm not kidding myself, because I know that a lot of them will be tending to be from left-leaning people. But a lot of the responses to that question were of that similar vein of kind of like, it's ridiculous that we even need to police, well, not police this, but like, it's ridiculous that we need to write legislation for people to let people just go about their daily lives.
Yeah, because you really put yourself in the front line personally. I mean, it must have been really quite emotionally exposing for you, finding out, seeing those attitudes displayed and feeling people's story. I mean, did it make you feel differently about who you are and how you fit into the world that we've got?
I think, like, yeah, definitely. I think in the first instance of that, it obviously in just at the start of Atlas Pandemica, I didn't really have a problem with being trans in myself. I didn't feel like it really came up in my daily life that much. There was obviously always incidents, hence the whole project being inspired by hate speech, but it didn't really bother me or affect me that much. And as you do with any project, as I constantly learned more and more, I started to see all of the kind of problems that were around me. And as I started to suddenly become more aware of these things, I started having kind of real crises, like on a personal level and just like on a kind of bigger level in terms of like, I think I'm at quite a lucky stage in where I am in my transition, but I genuinely fear for the future of for future trans generations, to be honest. And it's hard to say, but it's important to say that there's been like, I've definitely had incidents not related to Atlas Pandemica in the past year, but I've had a lot of incidents happen that have really just kind of shown me that how much of a problem this is. Like, well, here's something. Slap bang in the middle of the pandemic, I was in Dumfries on a night out. It was when everything had kind of been eased, and I was having a really bad night. I'd met up with a friend that I hadn't seen in years, and we were just having a drink, and I was just getting someone in my face every 5 minutes. And then there were some altercations, and it kind of resulted in my friend like pull me out of a situation that was about to end in me having my ass handed to me, to be totally honest. It was about to be quite ugly. And that's just one that really stuck with me, of a number of quite like of things that have made me really aware of my transness. And I think when you're put in those positions where the world forces you to be so aware of that, and then you have to turn around and look at a job where people think that on a fundamental, well, where people hate you for who you are, that stuff builds up. And then I think as you start to realize that maybe some of the places that you do reside, or some of the institutions or organizations or wherever that you once formerly thought were safe spaces, aren't necessarily the safest spaces as you thought they were. It's made me a lot more aware of that stuff.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's sad because I really wanted to be, and there's definitely a lot of positives, but I would have loved to have came off the end of Atlas Pandemica like champion for a more positive world, but I'm kind of skeptical at this point.
Showing you a different world, and one that you know, from what you're saying there, it sounds like you feel like it's getting worse, eh?
I don't think I'm a pessimistic person.
No, I wouldn't say so.
I'm glad you think so. But I don't want to get too into the whole doom and gloom of things, because I think by virtue of what we're doing, we need to persevere. That's the only way we're gonna get through this. But I think the assumption that everything's gonna get better from now is a vast assumption. I've been really interested over the course of the pandemic. Well, for anyone listening at home, in fact, I think I got it in my wonderful intro that I'm in my final year of university. So I read quite a lot of kind of academic and cultural theory. And someone I came across during the course of of Atlas Pandemica was a Christian thinker called Rene Girard. Have you heard of him?
Nope.
So he wrote kind of about pandemics as kind of discourse for basically like social upheaval. So like And I kind of think that's really applicable. Like when you see the pandemic and you see everything that's kind of been going on with the British government, like it's actually kind of really scary. And I think off the back of him, he has a really interesting theory on scapegoats during pandemics. And basically the criteria for a scapegoat during a pandemic is it has to be someone who sits outside society, which is why I personally think, going by that theory, I think that's why things like Black Lives Matter, and particularly the trans issue, we've got the whole conversion therapy going on. I think that's why all of these ostracized communities are facing such backlash at the moment, is because we do sit outside the conventional norm.
Well, another fantastic question that you asked was about that norm. I mean, you asked, what do cis people take for granted? How did that go? Did you manage to draw the cis community into the project at all?
That was a really funny provocation to ask, because it totally backfired in my face. I thought that provocation was gonna be really good, because I was like, oh, we're gonna voice loads of trans people and we're really gonna bring this issue forward and humanize trans people, essentially, which it's terrible that we should have to humanize trans people anyway. But that wasn't what happened at all. Loads of cis people started contributing. We got some trans responses, but we got a lot of cis responses and a lot of woke cis responses. We got some kind of as we did through the project, we got some arseholes, but yeah, a lot of cis people commented with. There was one I remember receiving that. I remember a couple of years ago speaking to one of my friends, and I was like, yeah, we were speaking about trans identity, and I was speaking about how one of the things I think is really difficult is relearning all that coding of a gender. So relearning all of these things that people have their whole lives to come to associate as part of them. And I thought that was quite an intricate issue that only trans people would think of. And I remember someone who I personally knew them, and we'd never really spoke about it, but they put in that response. And I remember being like, whoa, that's the fact that we're getting cis people thinking about this is a massive win for me. And it kind of translated this whole kind of cis trans conversation, then kind of translated over into some of the podcasts that we did, which you can find over at the LGBTQ Voices podcast because you're obviously so into podcasts if you're listening to us right now. But yeah, that was really interesting how it poured into that, because I had got to have a conversation with my own dad about my trans identity, and we had that kind of space to speak about the ground between transness and cisgenderness, because people are involved in your life as much as being trans is very much my thing. There is people that it is going to affect. So it was just great to open up that dialogue, really.
That's brilliant. I think we're all getting this picture of this amazing sort of set of conversations and stuff that you were drawing in, opinions, ideas. So how on earth did you draw it all together? And what are you kind of hoping that people are going to get from the work that you've done?
It was pretty weird to try and draw it all together because it was pretty sporadic. So am I allowed to say about the maps?
Say whatever you like.
That's okay. Yeah, so we're all the Atlas Pandemica artists have been working on kind of transferring their projects into maps. So that was kind of my major kind of accumulation of a lot of the material, because we kind of had because of the nature of it, and we had a lot of physical conversations, a lot of online conversations, some recorded, some weren't because of just the sensitivity to a lot of it. And then we had the provocation responses from all the online platforms. So we kind of drew this together in a map of hate speech. Initially I wanted to kind of take a map and pardon me, sorry. I wanted to kind of fill in a map with bits of hate speech that people have actually received on the street, so people can kind of stop being like, oh, why is the LGBTQ community like complaining so much? Because you get that all the time, like, you know, like, oh, there's people who don't eat, and it's like, no one said there wasn't. So it's kind of about like drawing all that together so people could look at this map of hate speech and be like, oh, wow, this is something that happens, and it's something that happens here. I think we're really bad in, I'll say the UK as a whole, for like thinking that all of these issues like don't affect us and they're all in America or they're in other countries, and it's just not true. And then the flip side of the map was quite sparse. Well, not sparse, but it wasn't as arranged. It was really just quotes from conversations and parts and just Tinder provocation responses again. And I just kind of wanted to leave them there for people to reflect on, because for me, I'm so blessed to get this insight into so many beautiful lives and beautiful stories that people have just so kindly shared with me. And I want to kind of pass that on to a degree, but I also just kind of want to leave that room for people to really consider these issues. And this is what I kind of wanted to do with the provocations and any question actually that's just been asked over the course of the project. I just wanted to leave something that people would look at and go, oh, I've never thought of that before. Because I think if we want people to actually come around to LGBTQ identity or stop being so hostile towards us, we actually do just need to continue and open up that dialogue, and also just bring up those little points that people go, oh yeah, I actually hadn't thought of it like that. And they're not going to change their mind instantly, but that, you know, planting that seed is that's half the battle.
Yeah, I can't wait to see your map. It's still in production, but it's going to be fascinating. I mean, I know, you know, when we started this, the process of working without a particular end result in mind was a very new experience for you. You've always normally been working towards making a piece of music or an event, or, you know, I mean, so that idea of an open-ended inquiry was new, wasn't it? So I mean, how did that go for you, and what did you get from it? What did you learn from it?
Oh, I hated it. No, it was it's not how I work though, and it was interesting because obviously the pandemic kind of stretched out longer than we thought it would, and I've been working through university with it as well. But something that I have come to learn is, with a big part of this being towards Atlas Pandemica, is actually as an individual, I really need those solid outputs. Actually, I found it really interesting, like suddenly not having that, because as you've just said, like I like having a song finished by the end of the day, or like I've wrote a chorus. Like they're all things that are very like, they're very much there, physically speaking, I guess. And there's a lot of times where I'd be like doing things for Atlas Pandemica, and I think going out of your comfort zone in these ways is integral to kind of learning more about yourself. But yeah, it was really interesting watching myself try to deal with this ambiguity of my work. And like I'd be sit down to write Tinder provocations, or I'd like suddenly collect responses. I remember when we had an Atlas reporting thing due, I remember going through all the provocation responses, and this was many months ago at this point, and I remember being like, what on earth am I going to do with any of these? Like, how? And because I work with sound, I was like, what do I do with all these words? Like, I can't just turn them into something that. So yeah, it was a really interesting kind of, particularly as someone who's about to kind of come out of university and feels quite confident about starting their whole freelance practice again. It was quite interesting to take that step back when you're feeling quite confident in yourself and go like, oh, how, yeah, it just makes you think differently. Makes you think, huh?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I'm. To me, it's an important part of the process. Is surprising yourself with that. Where are we? Where's this going to go? And I think that it's also it's part of what we've been dealing with through the pandemic. Is like all of that certainty has been taken away.
Mm-hmm.
What is going to come back? Is it we're going back to normal, whatever that is, and or not, and so I think in some way we've mirrored that process through Atlas. I mean, where just to sort of round up, I mean, is there anywhere that you take this next, or do you just never want to see it again because it's made you miserable and uncertain?
It's yeah, there's definitely kind of a little bit of that at the back of my mind, but I actually had one of the other Atlas Pandemica artists, Peter Smith. He came along, really kind of pulled me out of a hole at one point when I was feeling really kind of rubbish about everything. And we had a really positive conversation about the next stages and kind of like taking inspiration from one other thing that I did learn over the course of Atlas was to hold my cards kind of closer to my chest. And I think going forward, that's definitely something we need to do, because there's some local issues that really do need addressed, but we kind of just need this conversation burning in the background, and we need to be building up that community, because you can't tackle issues on your own. As we've established through this, we're stronger together. That sounds a wee bit indie ref political, but it wasn't meant that. Anyway, so yeah, basically just continuing to grow and kind of cultivate that community so that as local issues, local, rural, kind of Dumfries-based issues or whatever arise, we then have the strength in numbers to actually just tackle them heads on, rather than something coming up, something being thrown in one of these Facebook groups about how outrageous, like whatever J.K. Rowling's just said or whatever, and we just sit and complain about it. Maybe this time we have a group of people that are actively engaged and willing to tackle the issue heads on.
It's a powerful idea. It always brings to me that question of like, well, if we're talking about together, it's like, well, how far does that extend? Because the project was very much focused around Dumfries and Galloway as a region, and as a community. So I mean, my hope out of what you're talking about is that trans community, that LGBTQ plus community, however you describe it, also feels part of that regional community. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that in itself is a very powerful, kind of prominent idea. It definitely, that resonates with me, because I think from a very young age, I've always been determined to work in the arts and move away from Dumfries, and so many decisions in my life have been made based on where my identity is going to be kind of comfortably, or where it's not going to be interrogated, essentially. And I think for me, like, and credit where it's due. Like once I found the Stove network, I found a bit more of a home in the region, but I knew that I was never gonna. And I mean, I'm coming back to Dumfries and Galloway now, but I never really expected. I never really saw myself as part of that regional community.
Well, you've done a lot for it in the bits that you have been doing. So, thank you for all of that, and thank you for the chat. That's been a lovely morning.
No, thank you. What a lovely way to spend the morning, as you say. Yeah.
So, cheers, Jenna. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next Atlas Pandemica podcast. And you can also see Jenna's work at atlaspandemica.org and find her podcasts and Instagram threads by following LGBTQ+ Voices. Okay. Cheers, Jenna. Take care.
See you later. Bye.